Hello and welcome to Beebe Book Buzz, the monthly program where your Lucius Beebe Memorial librarians gather to talk about the books that have inspired us recently and share them with you. I'm Karen Stern and I'm from the reference department, as are my two colleagues here with me today, Alyssa Staples and Jeff Clapes. And I think we have a really great variety, I would say, of books to talk about today. And I think, Jeff, you might be it.
I'm starting off?
You're starting off,
Actually,
yep.
I've been reading a ton of stuff lately. I don't know, you go in waves, and for some reason I just have been reading a lot.
Yeah, look at the pile he's got here for us.
Yeah.
No,
and I've got this pile at home that I'm working through too. But one of the ones I wanted to talk about today is kind of been hot this summer because it was nominated for the long list, the Man Booker Prize, which always is awarded in October. They released their list of nominees a couple months ago, and this was one of them. It's a Canadian author. And I think I've read a few of the nominees, and I think she is certainly a strong contender for making the cut
right.
Further down the line. It's called Washington Black by Essie Edugyan, and she lives in Vancouver, I believe. And this is just the most, if you want literary but not so literary that you feel overwhelmed by it, it's great. It's an adventure story. It's historical fiction. It's a really strong character story with redemption and that kind of stuff. So the 60-second summary of it is that the main character is an 11-year-old boy who is a slave. It starts in the 1860s at I think it's a sugarcane plantation in Barbados in the Caribbean. And the slave master there is particularly atrocious. And his brother, at some point, who is a scientist, essentially, from Britain, comes and kind of adopts Washington Black, who is the character. George Washington Black is his name. The young boy, because he sees potential in him to assist him in his scientific experiments. Mm-hmm. So this causes conflicts with the rest of the slaves, and he's being kind of treated differently, but they develop this relationship, and the rest of the book is all about the relationship between these two characters who ordinarily wouldn't go together, but they need each other in different ways. And the big scientific experiment that the brother is involved in this is the 1860s after all, so balloon travel is a big new thing back then, and so he's experimenting with different ways that you could create a hot air balloon that could actually be used for various purposes, including transportation. And ultimately they use it to get away from there's a horrible relationship between the two brothers, and of course there's the whole slave issue. And then the book just goes on from there in the most amazing directions. They end up in the Arctic, in Morocco, in London, in the Underground Railroad in the Middle Atlantic states. So if you like that kind of adventure where characters are going off doing kind of amazing things, the thing I really liked about it, and it's hard to pigeonhole this book because it is so different. I think anybody who liked the actual book, The Underground Railroad,
yeah, I was going to say
out, that. Partly because it deals with similar time period, but in a kind of quirky way. And I also thought that although it's very different from The Essex Serpent, The Essex Serpent, which I'm pretty sure one of us has talked about at some point in these
I did.
In these programs, it reminded me a little bit of that, just because it's the same time period, and a lot of the story is about these characters who don't necessarily seem like they would bond,
right?
But they do, and also
well, and there's a science
there's
connection.
the science connection,
right?
So there is actually interesting stuff about oceanography and science. When they end up in the Arctic, they're looking for actual samples of different animals that can be displayed back in London.
Well, it has a little bit of everything.
It has a little bit of everything, and I think the thing that makes me think of Essex Serpent is just the fact that the characters who are exploring science in the day, in the time period that the book takes place. These are not people who should have been doing this. No
Right.
11-year-old slave.
Right, and no woman, no middle-class woman in the Essex.
So
right.
there's a lot of that kind of just throws you off a little bit, but the characters are really well drawn and the adventure is great. So
would it appeal to people who like other sort of adventure stories from that period as well, like
I
maybe
think so.
Treasure Island or I don't know, some of the classics?
It's more literary than that, obviously,
Sure.
and it's
Treasure Island.
I think. But I mean, in terms of literary style, the language
Right.
is very lush writing.
Right.
It's an award nominee, so it has that kind of aspect to it. Her writing is beautiful.
But still approachable, right?
But
Because
it's
a lot of the
very-
Man Booker nominees can get
No,
a
this
little
Esoteric.
intimidating.
this,
yeah.
this is not
say the
esoteric. I
least,
think you could
least.
really, and anybody could really enjoy this. And like I said, if anybody who liked Underground Railroad, I think
Yeah.
this is a good match for that. And it's the plot and the adventure is there, but the whole thing is about these two
Bond,
characters.
right, and that holds the story together, I would
And
imagine. Yeah.
what takes them apart brings them together, and they're really, really well done.
Sounds
so that's
great.
That really
Definitely,
sound good.
yeah,
Washington
definitely.
Black by Essie Edugyan.
Okay, definitely on my list. Alyssa, what have you got?
I've got another weird one.
I love this one. I'm excited about it.
So
And it's pink.
It's pink. Fun point of this, but it's not as fun as the cover may make it seem. So this book is Severance by Ling Ma. It is her debut. This is also a tough one to categorize. It's a lot of things at once. It's kind of a millennial coming-of-age story. It's an immigrant story. It's apocalyptic horror. It's office satire. And then on top of all of that, it's actually hilarious. So there's a lot going on. So I'll try my best to explain.
So Walking Dead meets The Office meets Laugh-In.
I mean, in a way, but it's there's no. You'll see. There's not as much gore and violence and fear as
Like Walking
the
Dead.
Walking
It's not
Dead.
that kind
yeah,
of, it's not that kind of a
though there are
apocalypse.
zombies, it's not the brain-eating,
Right,
flesh-hungry ones that you may think of. So basically, this book revolves around a woman named Candace Chen. As I said, she's like a millennial new adult in a present-day New York City. She moved to America at 6 with her Chinese parents. They're short, non-linear chapters, so it moves at a good clip, but it does go back in time, and then it talks about what's happening during this apocalypse, and then what's happening after. So basically what happens is a fungal infection breaks out and infects everyone on Earth.
Like Athlete's Foot? Or?
Not quite.
I always think those are hilarious, with worldwide fungal infections.
It's worse than it sounds. It's worse than foot odor.
What happens?
So a few people do not get infected, and Candace is one of them. The people who do get infected, which they're referred to as fevered in the book, and they refer to them that way because, I mean, you can think of them, I thought of them as zombies, but they basically, anyone who's infected is trapped in this endless loop of mindless tasks that they used to do during their lives.
Right.
So one example is a woman, like an older woman, sets her table over and over and unsets it and sets it. And there's no
Right.
kind of consciousness there. Another young girl is reading an upside-down book, just flipping through the pages. Another woman tries on everything in her closet over and over and looks in the mirror.
Right.
I mean, and they do this until they starve and die.
That's pretty creepy.
But
Or your closets fall down.
it actually is kind of it's so strange that it is one of the creepiest iterations of kind of zombie outbreak that I've ever read. And it really serves to emphasize the main point of this book, which I think is really about American consumerism, our mindless consumption of things, objects, and at the cost of people's lives all around the world.
Right.
So it kind of, so if you think of the zombies in that way, it really just serves to highlight that part of the story. Ultimately, she she joins a band of survivors, and I mention this because I want to highlight the humor of this book that I may not be coming across yet. So she joins a band of survivors, and those survivors are led by a former IT guy named Bob, who's kind of using this role to get the respect he thought he deserved in life but never received. And it's these kind of absurd, humorous situations where, though the author is not cracking jokes through the book, but it genuinely is laugh out loud funny when you think about the end of the world and having to follow Bob the IT guy.
And
right?
everybody's workplace has a Bob.
Everybody.
You know.
And nobody wants to end up, your survival should not depend on Bob. It really doesn't go well for them either. But I want to highlight that New York City is really a character in this, which sounds kind of strange, but Candace is a photographer, so we get a lot of rich descriptions of the city before and during the outbreak, which is super interesting. And her writing is, it's not simple because it's perfectly crafted, but there's nothing overstated about it. It's really every word has a purpose. Her style of writing is sparse but very effective, and the pace it keeps you turning the pages with just the right amount of suspense. I really recommend this book to almost all readers.
Yeah, there's something for everyone in that one for sure.
Genuinely. I mean, don't let the apocalypse part turn you off from this book.
Right, because
it's so much
that's not
more
actually
than
the point of the book.
It's really not even like the driving factor of this book.
So what could a read-alike be? I can't even think of one.
It is so hard to think of them, but it really, I think, falls into a lot of the immigrant stories that we're hearing, because that's a huge part of this book is Candace's Chinese heritage and how that affected her, and what moving to America did to her and her family, and that shaped the kind of person she was. So it does, if you're interested in that, it is a kind of a funny take on that kind of a story.
Right. Yeah.
But naming a read-alike is kind of impossible.
But there's no recipes like from a cozy mystery, cookbook mystery or something.
No, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, maybe that's high praise, because, I mean, we're always looking for something original, right? So maybe she really has done something different.
Completely different.
And
Really
this is her debut, so she's someone
impressive.
to watch.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, really good.
Cool. Okay. I have something a bit different. This book is The Overstory by Richard Powers. And it's been a kind of I would call it like a sleeper hit. I mean, it has really, really good, if you go online and look at the ratings in this book.
Well, it's another nominee.
It's another, that's right, and it's another
from the same
nominee
list.
in the same list as Jeff's. So it's probably, I would say it's one of the most powerful books about the human race and its place on our planet and in nature that I've ever read. And that's, you know, it's a story of 9 very different people, and the story of the trees, yes, the trees, because there's a lot of what this is about, that connect these people. The trees and their stories are kind of woven into the fabric of the book and are definitely integral to the story, but not in a way that feels like a science lesson or you know, pedantic in any way. The trees and the forest that they create are characters too. I mean, I want to be a little careful. I'm not talking about talking trees. I'm not talking about, you know, eyes or anything anthropomorphized at all. In fact, quite the opposite. But I want to start with the people, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the trees. In the beginning, you could almost be forgiven for thinking that this was a series of short stories or something, because it does start out bringing you the stories of these 9 people. One of whom, for instance, is a Vietnam soldier who is shot down and is saved when his parachute is caught in a banyan tree. So there's his connection to a tree. There's another young man who is becoming an artist and whose family has kept over generations since they immigrated from Scandinavia a photographic record. They moved to the Midwest, kept this photographic record of what became a giant American chestnut tree, which you may know are now pretty much extinct. And literally the grandfather and the father took pictures every season of this tree. So what you end up with is this record of the tree as it grows. Think of almost like a flip book where you can flip through and see this tree becoming this amazing giant. So he's left with this sort of artifact and is wondering what to do with it and what to do with himself as well. There's a college student who has basically no relationship with trees. She's just a party animal. But she has a near-death experience that then basically means that she sort of receives this mystical calling. She comes back from the dead and has received a calling that draws her into the story of trees. There's a scientist, she's hearing and speech impaired as a young girl anyway, and she is making discoveries about trees and how they communicate. So these are, that's 4 of the stories, but there are 5 more people whose stories you also get. And gradually, through this book, they become interwoven. The kernel of the story, a big part of the story is where several of the characters come together in order to try to save some of the old growth forest on the West Coast. Some of the huge, beautiful redwood trees that are being torn down for profit, basically. So there's and in that central story, you get everything. I mean, talk about a book that has a little bit of everything. You have adventure, espionage, love story, you have a tragedy, and eventually hope and redemption. I mean, you might think there's not a good ending to a story about the destruction of trees. I was surprised to find that there was some hope and in the end of this book. So I don't want anyone to think that this is a depressing story. It's not. This is a long, deep read. But it's never slow or boring. That's what his mastery of the form. He's written a lot of books, and he's kind of an unsung hero in some ways. But this one, he has these huge themes, universal themes, and all these characters, and yet you are drawn slowly and steadily. It's not a fast pace, but you are drawn in, and you can't. It definitely grabs you. And through all of that, he is sharing this deep knowledge that he has, scientific knowledge that he has of trees. So that is how the trees become characters for you. And I wanted to just read, because it's a little bit hard to know how trees can become characters. So I thought I'd turn to somebody who's a better wordsmith than me, i.e. Barbara Kingsolver, who wrote the New York Times review of the Overstory in April of this year. And she says this: "Trees do most of the things you do, just more slowly. They compete for their livelihoods and take care of their families, sometimes making huge sacrifices for their children. They breathe, eat, and have sex. They give gifts, communicate, learn, remember, and record the important events of their lives. With relatives and non-kin alike, they cooperate, forming neighborhood watch communities, to name one example, with rapid response networks to alert others to a threatening intruder. They manage their resources in bank accounts, use past market trends to predict future needs. They mine and farm the land, and sometimes move their families across great distances for better opportunities. Some of this might take centuries, but for a creature with a lifespan of hundreds or thousands of years, time must surely have a different feel about it."
That's beautiful.
And this book transports you to this place that has a different time span and a different feel to it. And I think that's the best thing I can say about it. It just takes you away and makes you think all these new things. And I found it really amazing.
Yeah. I felt I read it as well, and I had not read her review, but it makes me think of what you said about how it is a long book. It is very slow and deliberate, but it doesn't feel long. But it feels tree speed.
It feels tree speed. You think of that. If anybody's seen the Hobbit, the Tolkien series of the movies or the books, the Ents.
The Ents.
It reminds you. It's like the Ents. I mean, there's a lot going on there, but it doesn't happen quickly.
It reminds me of a couple of vacations I've been on, like out west, where you see some like bristlecone pine that was 4,000 years old, and you come to grips with the idea that this living being
was around before Jesus or before.
And I always kind of, in reading that story, there was that kind of felt like you were moving at that pace to understand what their world is like.
And he just manages to weave the details in this way. It's kind of this one is useful to me right now because we're doing a sustainability series at the library, a series of programs that's all about all kinds of aspects of sustainability, not just the natural world, but this book talks about what trees can teach us, about how to do things more effectively and efficiently, which is, biomimicry, which is one of the really promising things that we're learning, is to look at nature and find out what it can teach us about how we can better make things, design things, using less energy, using all those
Had
things.
a lot more time than we have to figure
Right,
it
they've
out.
had a long time. The trees have been around for way longer than we have, and they've figured it out. And that's what he's really good at showing you in this book, along with telling you this amazing story too. So
There's a good Radio Lab episode about trees and how they communicate.
Oh,
Just throwing it out there.
no, yeah, Radiolab, and then there's the book that Beth actually talked on one of these programs.
Oh, that's right.
The Vorleben. It's
Hidden
called
Life of Trees.
The Hidden Life of
Yeah.
Trees.
That was a big bestseller last year.
That's right. It's still actually pretty
Yeah.
popular. So there's all kinds of things to read around this too. So that's The Overstory by Richard Powers. I think, Jeff,
and
you've got another one about the
Speaking of
natural world.
Speaking of nonfiction, like The Hidden Life of Trees, this is a little bit different. I like to throw in nonfiction every now and then just because I read about half and half. But not all nonfiction is really good discussion oriented, or depends on what you're interested in. But I really loved this book that came out just a couple months ago called The Immeasurable World by William Atkins, who's a young British writer. And it's exclusively deserts. That's all it is. It's all about different desert environments. The thing that I really liked about it, aside from just my own personal interest, I've been to a number of deserts, and I appreciate that kind of environment, but he's just a really good writer. And so if you like nonfiction that tells you something really interesting but does it in a really beautiful literary way, where it almost seems, it's not narrative nonfiction in that sense that some other writers have, but they're just beautiful stories. So I have to remind myself of the different places. He actually goes and lives in 7 different deserts around the world, and each one is very different in different ways.
Which you may not realize about deserts.
Yeah, I mean there are significant differences in desert environments, and some of that is the human culture that is associated with each one, and some of it is the actual natural environment, because deserts have different flora and fauna and
which probably
and
then
geology
informs
and
what the humans
yeah.
do there. Yeah.
Exactly. But the thing that I found really interesting about it is that every one of his sections talks not about just the environmental aspect of the desert, but he focuses on some aspect, usually human related, that tells a story. And so, for example, he goes to the Great Victorian Desert in southern Australia, and the story there is the conflict between Europeans who came to Australia very late in the game, displacing and causing problems with the indigenous Aboriginal tribes that lived there, and also doing nuclear testing that happened over decades back when when England, which really didn't have its own places to do testing, like the U.S. did, was able to partner with Australia, and
Right.
so there's a whole story about how it affected those people who lived there. Another one, he visits the southwestern U.S., the Sonoran Desert, and also I guess it's the Sonoran Desert in southern Arizona, and there the story is all about border issues, which for him are a little distant because he's not American and he's not Mexican.
Right.
So he can look a little bit more dispassionately at what for us is a much more emotional issue because he's seeing
Right.
it from afar. But he interviews people, and another one that he does, a place I'd love to go and don't know if I'll ever get there, the desert in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan around what used to be known as the Aral Sea, which was at one point the 4th largest body
That's
of
right.
water in the world,
And
and
is
now
no
it's
more.
like about the size of Lake Quannapowitt.
Yeah.
And it's entirely due to man-made environmental decisions. This once enormous body of water has virtually vanished, and within 20 years will be probably completely gone. So every one of the places that he goes has this side to it, that he's talking about the environment, but he's talking about what makes this desert different from all the other deserts.
Right.
That's a lot like yours in the way that the natural world informs the
Sure.
humans
Yeah.
and vice versa,
Sure.
what we do to affect
Sure.
that world, and to pull in current events and then political histories too.
Hey,
That's-
sustainability, baby.
Sustainability.
Yeah.
So I think anybody who likes that sort of nature writing would really enjoy these, because each chapter almost makes each of the different deserts like a character with a personality.
Definitely.
Right.
And a life and experiences.
That sounds great.
So that's the Immeasurable World, Journeys in Desert Places.
Right.
By William Atkins.
Okay, we have just a little bit more time. Do you want to just talk about your very last one? We're going to let Jeff talk a lot today.
Oh,
Do
you
all
want
the
to-
heavy
did
lifting.
you have
No,
another one?
no,
Okay.
no.
All right. Yeah, what else? I
Lauren.
brought this. I have all kinds of things I can talk about. I loved this and wasn't expecting to. I read it because it was, I should tell you
us
what it is. It's Florida by Lauren Groff, and a lot of people know Lauren Groff because of the
Fates and the
Fates and
Furies.
Furies.
Fates and Furies, which I actually have not read.
I have read,
I
but
missed
I
it
will.
when it came out.
I didn't. I love her writing, I will say. I mean, Fates and Furies taught me that much, and so I do want to read this for sure, but I did not make it all the way through Fates and Furies.
Oh, okay.
Well, was this one short stories?
This is short stories,
So
and I
that's
think
different for
a lot of
her.
people might have also read her first one, which was The Monsters of Templeton.
Yes, that was a big
which
one.
I did read and enjoyed very much, and that was kind of an interesting debut. That it had, I wouldn't call it magical realism, but it was. That's a really interesting book.
Yep.
And I just picked this up because I needed something kind of short, and it was nominated for what? National Book Award. I think she's on the list for the
That's
National
right.
Book Award. And I do like her writing. I don't actually like Florida all that much. I mean, I've been there many times.
All of our listeners in Florida.
I appreciate
Sorry.
Florida.
Oh my gosh.
I like aspects of Florida, but it's an unusual state. It has has all kinds of interesting,
newsworthy a
yeah,
lot
different.
of the time.
There's politics, there's environment, there's But so the idea behind this book is that it's a series of short stories, each one exploring a slightly different aspect of what makes Florida Florida. And there are wealthy people, there's not wealthy people, there's indigenous people, there's abandoned kids, there's like
Right.
and they don't really tie together in the same way that, say, the Overstory, where you have a bunch of different characters that all come together. It's not quite like that, but on the other hand, the stories aren't totally disconnected. So for people who don't like reading short stories
Who
because
are
they
worried
don't go
about
together,
short stories, right?
these do really tie together in a really nice way, because Florida is
Florida.
it's what it's all about.
Right.
And in fact, a couple of them take place outside of Florida, but Florida is still important in those stories. So it's kind of hard to explain in that
Yeah,
sense.
no.
But I loved it.
Right, okay.
And if you've been to Florida, whatever your feelings about it as a vacation or a place to stay, you see it all in here. And
That's great.
I really would recommend it, particularly if you want something that's a quick and pithy read.
Okay.
Yeah.
And beautifully written, I
And
would
beautifully
imagine,
written,
because
yeah.
she always is.
Really,
right?
really, really nicely written.
Okay. Well, I think that's what we've got for today. As I said, a good variety for you to chew on for the next month. And we will be back again next month with another selection for you on Beebe Book Buzz. Until then, goodbye.